This week's call to action. What difficult conversation are you putting off? Hello and welcome to 1% Better. I'm your host, Joe Ferraro. Episode 19 brings me Sheila Heen, recommended first by Chris Voss on episode 9, and she joins me today to talk about her book, Difficult Conversations. What a title. That title may turn you off, but it's a book you need to get. If you have not bought the book, if you have not read the book, there's plenty to get from this conversation. The question I asked at the top was this: what difficult conversation in your life have you been putting off? For me, this interview comes at a great time. There's 2 or 3 difficult conversations I need to have, one of which is full go, one of which requires me to listen to this interview again. Sheila gives framework, she gives tactics, she gives mindset. Sheila helps me, and I know she's going to help you get 1% better at having difficult conversations. Some people may enjoy that process. Most people, they don't like to face the difficult conversation. Today's episode is about getting comfortable in that uncomfortable zone of how to communicate with another person you care about, even when the topic is difficult. You can reach me on Twitter at FerraroOnAir or email me at get1percentbetter@gmail.com. If there's a way that I can help you, reach out and let me know. But one way you are absolutely getting 1% better is with this conversation with Sheila Heen. Enjoy. Today, I'm lucky enough to be talking with a communication expert, as we often do on the show. But in this case, a 1999 book sent me to Sheila Heen, and a little bit of a hat tip to Chris Voss from episode 9. I'm joined today by Sheila Heen. Sheila, thank you so much for being here.
I am delighted to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, when you spoke about listening to the show, it always means a lot. And the bottom line here today is we're talking about how to have better, difficult conversations. And listeners will know there's nothing I can get more excited about. And I think it's just something that this book was published in 1999, and yet I'm coming out of the woodwork to contact you.
I know. I mean, one of the things that has been amazing for us over the years is to see the book just migrate into all these different places that we didn't expect it to go. I was sitting next to a woman at a school fundraiser when we first moved to this tiny town in New England. And, you know, we were talking about what we do for a living. And I said, well, I teach something called Difficult Conversations. And she said, did you know there's a book called that? And this is probably 10 years after it was published.
Oh,
I said, I do know that, actually. And she said, oh, I use it to teach couples tango.
Really?
Yeah.
Can it help me tango?
Apparently I need some help learning to tango, but she said that in the first lesson, inevitably, the couple gets in a big fight about all of the stuff in their relationship because they're struggling, and it has very subtle signals. It's a dance with subtle signals, and so it quickly devolves into, like, you're not listening to my signals, or you're not being clear, just like always.
Wow.
And so she sends them home with difficult conversations.
I love it.
Which was fascinating to me.
Oh, my goodness. I love it. And the book is called Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. And I have a slew of notes and questions that we will never get to. But the first thing we have to do is drive people to the book. The second thing is trying to set some context. I've only read the book once. So I can tell everyone listening right now it's not a one-time read. Every review I've read, Sheila, talks about the ability to go back to it, to kind of refer to it again. Tom Peters says he's dog-eared multiple pages. He's on his 3rd read, and that's a heck of an endorsement. So the context is we're going to try to do something that's impossible to do and summarize this book in 40 minutes. So that's that's not possible, but we want to definitely allow some growth there. And let me start with this question, which is a little bit outside the box, if you will. The title. I absolutely love the title. It's what I try to grow in every day. It's what my listeners trying to get 1% better every day thrive in. But despite it being a New York Times bestseller, it occurred to me, I wonder if that title drew people away from the book. Did you ever consider that?
Oh, you bet we did. Yeah, we had long conversations about title because a lot of people, ourselves included, were worried it's a negative title. In other words, it is describing the problem, not the solution. And so we tried to come up with a title that would clearly describe the solution, like maybe learning conversations or whatever, but that really loses the juice of why we all need help. And so we ended up settling back on our original title. And interestingly, I think that's one of the reasons it has had such staying power, because year in and year out, walking by a stack of books and seeing difficult conversations, I think people say, oh, yeah, I have those. I could use some help. I wonder if this would be useful to me.
Yeah, so you end up being with them from a marketing standpoint. In the short term, it doesn't necessarily pay off, but in the long term, it ends up being what Ryan Holiday would call a perennial seller.
Yeah, it speaks to what we would call the felt problem that we each have. So I'm interested in books that might help me with a challenge that I currently have on my hands. And this is one of those challenges. You know, the other thing that the marketing department talked to us about way back when was, you know, this isn't really, going to be much of a gift book. When in fact, it has become a huge gift book, meaning someone will hand it to a friend or a colleague or a family member and say, look, I know you're struggling with these things at work or with your fill in the blank. This book has been really helpful to me, and it might be helpful to you.
Helpful to me definitely disarms it a little bit. Where I want to go next is the idea that I never assume we know exactly what we're talking about. So even though the title seems self-explanatory, the question I would ask you is what has to take place in a conversation? What context that would ultimately define it as a difficult one?
Well, interestingly, a difficult conversation from our point of view is any conversation that makes you anxious, that feels difficult to you, that you lie awake worrying about, where you feel that the stakes are high, or there's a lot of uncertainty, or there's a lot of emotion involved. There's often history in the relationship. And so, ironically, the conversation doesn't even have to have happened to feel difficult, because I've had it with you in my head. And you were just as uncooperative in that imagined conversation as I know you're going to be in real life. And so we really wanted to span both professional life and personal life to talk about the conversations that we know we need to have, but that we hesitate to have or we stumble through when we do try them.
Are some people more reluctant to have difficult conversations than others?
Sure. I mean, I think all of us in our families or through early experiences have experience with conflict or hard conversations. And you learn either, you know what, it's better to just let sleeping dogs lie and don't mess with it because it's not going to turn out well. Or you may be in a family where, you know, we are very direct with each other and we battle it out. And then, you know, we go out and play baseball afterwards and it's all fine. And the stories each of those two people will tell about what conflict, quote unquote, means in our relationship. For one, it's really potentially catastrophic and scary. And for the other person, it's a completely normal and expected feature of being in a relationship. And now those two people, of course, either marry each other or get thrown on the same team together. And we have a very different sense of how risky these conversations might be.
I'm thinking about sorting. I'm thinking about categorizing, which sometimes is helpful and sometimes it's unfair. In terms of sorting, are there personality traits? Are there types of people? What have you found in the research that begins to identify what people lean into difficult conversations, which ones lean away from them?
Boy, that is such a good question, and I don't have a ready answer. I do notice that there are a small subset of people in the world who would say, well, I don't have difficult conversations.
Do they really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And every single person in their life surrounding them would say, yeah, that's because you're the difficult person. You don't think those conversations are difficult because you can't see somebody else's point of view and you don't understand the impact that you're having. But the rest of us experience those conversations with you as quite difficult. And that to me has been interesting because I think we all know a handful of those people. And by the way, if you don't know a handful, it might be you. But what's interesting to us is that the people we know who fit that profile, a few of them have actually stumbled on difficult conversations and later come to us to say, us meaning me and my co-authors, say, wow, I really loved your book. And we're like, really? Because everybody finds you difficult. And I probably should not name names on this podcast.
No. Well, hopefully that it'll reach everyone who needs it. But I'll tell you, the reason I'm fascinated with labeling is because sometimes it feels like the appropriate thing as a tool, and sometimes it just feels like a sweeping generalization that doesn't feel fair at all. I'm thinking of one of the core bedrock ideas of the book is when you say that, each difficult conversation really is 3 conversations in one. So maybe by way of connecting the dots, we can open that idea up a bit.
Yeah. So one of the things that we stumbled on pretty quickly is that if we really wanted to understand these conversations, we had to look beyond what people were saying or not saying to each other and look at what people were really thinking and feeling in those conversations and about those conversations. And what we found pretty quickly is that the same kinds of things turn up in people's internal voice, we would say, meaning our thoughts and feelings that we may or may not say out loud. And those things are very predictable. And in that way, every difficult conversation, it doesn't matter who it's with or what it's about, has the same underlying structure. And that structure can loosely be categorized into 3 buckets, as you mentioned. So the first is what we call the what happened conversation. And that's about what has happened, what's happening now, and what we think should happen. And that story that we're telling about our conflict has 3 key components within it. So one is, what am I right about? A second is, whose fault is it that we're having this conflict, or whose fault is it that we're having such a hard time getting along? And then the third is why the other person is acting this way. What are their intentions or motivations or character that's causing them to be so, overbearing or controlling or fill in the blank? So that's all part of the story we tell. And if you listen to people when they say, oh my gosh, I got to tell you about this whole mess with my boss, the story they tell will have those 3 features embedded in it as key components. But there are 2 more things going on, 2 more buckets. A second is what we call the feelings conversation. Typically, by the time something becomes a difficult conversation, one and often both people or all people involved are grappling with some pretty complicated emotions of fear and anxiety and frustration and hurt and guilt and self-doubt, etc. But particularly in a professional context, we're trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do with those feelings? Because I'm kind of supposed to check my feelings at the door when I come to work, I think, and I can pick them up on the way home and take them home for my spouse to enjoy. But I'm supposed to really be professional. I'm supposed to stay away from feelings. The third bucket, then, the last bucket, is what we call the identity conversation. And this was kind of a late insight for us, actually. Chapter 6 did not exist until relatively late in the process. But we were puzzling over the fact that certain kinds of conversations will feel difficult to one person and easy to someone else. So for some people, saying no feels almost impossible when someone asks them for help. For somebody else, that's not that complicated. That person, though, has trouble firing someone when the person next door says, look, it's not a fun conversation, but it's not exactly hard. So we were puzzling over what's the difference. And eventually what we saw is that there's something the situation seems to say about you, who you are, or what kind of person you are, that feels like it's at stake. Am I competent? Am I a good person? Am I honest? Have I let myself down? Have I let someone else down? And so the identity conversation is really the conversation we're having with ourselves about ourselves. And those are sort of the underlying buckets of things that we're all wrestling with as we think about the situation where we need to sort it out and talk to someone, as well as in the conversation itself.
Yeah, really well set up and really well said in terms of showing how this is a book that you can go back to. So you have the what happened, you have the feelings, and you have the identity conversation. So I can jump into each of them. The first one I have to ask about is blame. Just candidly, I don't know what it is about blame that feels so good.
Well, you mean when you're blaming someone else rather than being blamed?
The difference between the satisfaction gained in blaming someone and then having you be blamed. I mean, I can't think of two worlds that are further apart.
I know. Isn't that fascinating? And I actually think it is related to identity, right? So these three buckets all work together. In other words, if I can figure out why this is your fault, well, then I'm the good person and you're the problem.
Plus, you feel like, speaking for myself, you feel like a solution maker. You feel like the fixer.
Right, exactly. And it's so obvious. If you just change your personality, everything will be so much better for you.
Well, you know what? It's funny. I can even go a little less than that. And I can say, for me, and I have to put myself right on the line for the listeners and for you to kind of unpack, is that if you feel accomplished about your problem-solving skills after time, over research, etc., there's this kick you get. Maybe it's serotonin, maybe it's an endorphin. I don't know. When you solve a problem. But yeah. I just find, and I don't know if the research backs this up, when you solve someone else's problem, they never quite feel as happy as you do. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It does make sense. But it also, by the way, I think helps us understand why sometimes getting a new insight into some of our own problems also actually gives us a kick. Because it's like, well, at least now I'm smart enough to know what's wrong with me.
Yeah.
Or why I keep making this mistake again and again.
Yeah, and those chapters argue that we should stop arguing about blame. We should leave out who's right and who's wrong and kind of just talk about, well, actually, let me clarify that. It actually appeared to me when I was reading that it was saying it's not about what happened. It's not about the facts. It's about what we think happened. Does that make sense?
It does. And for me, the easiest way to describe that first shift is to talk about shifting from who's right to why do we see this so differently. And if I can make my first task in the conversation understanding why we see it differently, it really sets me up with a clear purpose that involves both of us to sort out. So it's going to be much more of a dialogue. And if nothing else, we may not agree at the end of the conversation, but we at least understand why we tell a different story about it.
Wow, that's fascinating. So shifting from who's right to why do we see this so differently, that's a powerful idea. And my follow-up to that then would be, I wonder if that can then, in some places, seep into the identity piece where now business partners, feel a little bit foreign to one another or alienated once that's identified, that they feel so far apart on an issue?
Do you mean once they figure out why they see it differently?
Yeah, so we're coworkers and we're having this discussion and we're not worried about who's right anymore. We're saying, why do we see this so differently? And it becomes a learning conversation, as you write about.
It becomes a learning. Yeah, keep going. It becomes a learning conversation.
It becomes a learning conversation, and in a perfect world, that's great. But I wonder if at times it can make each other feel alienated or distant from the other person.
Certainly, you can discover that you actually see it even more differently than you first imagined, right?
Yeah.
In other words, as I thought we only disagreed on the timing of the strategy, now I'm understanding that you don't actually agree with even the underlying premise of the strategy, right? So sometimes what you learn is not necessarily good news. That's true. Although I think two things balance that. One is, it's not that it's now true and it wasn't before. It's just that now you know it's true, right? In other words, you've discovered something that was there all along and you're better off being aware of it. And then the second is, it comes back to what you were just saying a couple of minutes ago, which is the endorphin accomplishment of the two of us figuring out why we see it differently, I think actually starts to change our relationship a little bit.
Okay.
And so now we have a shared problem. Like, okay, well, gosh, we're really even further apart than I thought we were. Now what do we do?
So I'm not hearing a strong argument in the camp of ignorance is bliss.
It depends on how much that ignorance is going to bite you in the you-know-where.
Well, it always does, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it can be, and that goes back to the purpose of the conversation. I mean, life is too short to have every conversation, and so before I decide to tackle something, I want to think very carefully about, okay, what is it that I hope to accomplish, and how important is this to me?
Interesting. Let me highlight that. Life is too short to have every conversation, because I'm thinking of a listener now that says, I was taught to be an open communicator, and I just want to get this out in the open. I want to clear the air, all of those cliches. Your advice would be pump the brakes?
It would at least be why. And I actually think in other words, why do you want to clear the air, et cetera? And I actually think the answer probably will be, look, I'm feeling resentful or frustrated or badly treated or fill in the blank, right, in this relationship. And that's actually hurting the relationship in the longer term, and the relationship is important to me. And then I would say, great, then this is an important conversation for you to have. But every once in a while, and I actually just had this conversation with a friend recently where we were talking about how to bring up something with another friend. And I was suggesting that she could, in part, say, look, I feel like we should talk about this because it's important for our friendship. And I felt really unfairly accused and badly treated. And there was this pause, and the person I was advising, this friend of mine, said, yeah, I don't really feel like we're friends, and I don't really want to be friends with her. And I was like, okay. So now we actually are getting honest with ourselves about, so then how much does this matter? And do you want to invest time in it?
Perfect.
And that's what I mean about sort of decide what's my purpose and how important is this to me? And your self-respect and speaking up and sticking up for yourself is always an important thumb on that scale. But sometimes I think because I'm upset, I have to say something. And maybe, but maybe not.
That makes a lot of sense. I was mentoring a former student this week, and she basically said that she wanted to know why a certain person was acting a certain way. And I said, how important is this person in your future?
Yeah.
And, and the answer kind of unravels itself to say that may not be worth getting into that. I love that. I'm talking with Sheila Heen, best-selling author and founder of the Triad Consulting Group. Is this the kind of conversation framework that you would have with businesses and people as you consult, Sheila?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And often one of the things we're doing is sort of what we would call a hybrid project. And it's partly that we are facilitating or doing a little bit of an intervention on an executive team, let's say, that's having trouble, where you've got a couple of really strained working relationships and important disagreements or frustrations that those working relationships need help to sort through. But simultaneously, we're actually trying to give them the vocabulary and the skills and the insight to raise their game so that then they can pick up the thread and keep using those skills and embedding them in the organization more broadly. So we're both doing quote unquote kind of training and coaching alongside actually facilitating some important and real conversations.
So then from the boardroom to the kitchen table, your husband teaches negotiation at MIT.
He does.
And I want to know, do you use these tactics in your discussions with him at home?
Yes. So I do think sometimes we're a little quicker to realize or diagnose where we're going wrong. But it also means, how every couple has like a menu of 2 or 3 arguments that they just have in different forms over and over again?
Unfortunately, I do.
Yeah. So one of ours is that we fight about how we fight.
Ooh, that's very meta. Let me see if I follow this. Is he going to chapter 4 and he's saying, I know you're taking that from chapter 4? I mean, what's happening there?
Yeah. It would be, why didn't you so-and-so? And, I'm tired of having to remind you, and I feel bad about it, and then it's like, why do you always have to do this? And so the response is criticizing how it's being said or put on the table. Yeah, I consider myself very happily married. We've been married for 20, I don't know how many years now, 3, 4. But I would say that having a shared vocabulary has been really important to us, as well as been fodder sometimes for disagreement.
Well, you know what? Let's throw it right into the mix then and say, without getting personal and specific, we're here on a show where we're trying to give tactical advice, and we're certainly doing that, and you can't do it without context. But what would be one tool that either you and your husband or you and a friend have used consistently over and over again that someone listening right now could just immediately put into their relationship or business relationship, and it would just open the communication avenues?
Oh boy, I have to pick just one. So probably the one that gets the most play at our house is the idea of shifting from blame to joint contribution.
Okay.
So not just with my husband, but with my kids, So I've got 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, and particularly when the boys were younger, right, they'd get into it, and one of them would come to tattle or complain, so-and-so hit me. So that's blame, right? They did something wrong. It's their fault that we're in this fight. And our reaction was, okay, and what did you do right before that? What have you contributed to this conflict? And my older son actually took longer to catch on to the whole thing. And he would say, but he hit me, insisting. And I'd say, yeah, and that needs to be addressed for sure. That's one of the things that Petey definitely contributed. And I'm curious, looking back at the interaction, are there things that you wish or would advise yourself to have done differently that probably escalated the situation or didn't help? And so it's not that they're off the hook, but it is, if you want this to turn out differently, that will help you know what you should change in your interactions with your brother. And now we're going to go talk to Petey, and I'm going to ask him the same thing. And that conversation about, okay, what have I done or failed to do here that probably didn't help? And it's not 50-50. It might be 90-10. But even if my part was 10%, realizing, for instance, I knew this was coming and I avoided dealing with it until now, and so now it's actually more of a crisis, or it's gotten worse or festered, that's part of my contribution. And that's a great place to start the conversation. Yeah. Is with your own contribution, because it's basically communicates, look, this isn't about blame. It's actually about figuring out, how did we get here? What did we each contribute to the problem? Because that'll help us know, how do we change it going forward?
Yeah, that's big time. That's moving from blame to contribution is a tactic that we could definitely use. As we shift into the feelings part of it, again, I'll put myself in a vulnerable situation and say that throughout my life, I've heard people tell me, you are too sensitive. Is that possibly true? And as a corollary to that, like, is it universally and unilaterally true about someone? And if it is that a fair, I hate to use that word, but is that a fair tactic in a discussion, in a conversation?
Well, this also takes us into feedback territory, and the work that we did in the next book, Thanks for the Feedback, because one of the things that we learned in the course of that was some research suggesting that in terms of sensitivity, in the face of feedback, for example, how upset do you get and how long does it take you to recover? But in any difficult conversation, right, you're getting feedback from the other person on what they think or why they're frustrated with you, et cetera. Individual sensitivity can vary by up to 3,000%.
3,000%?
3,000%.
Wow, which is very thought-provoking, because within saying someone is too sensitive, that just amplifies, to me at least, well, yeah, that might be true, but it's so many degrees. You're making it sound like there's so many different degrees there. Yeah,
and what they really mean is you're more sensitive than me, or more sensitive than I wish you were, given what I did. Yes. I wish you were less upset.
If you were less sensitive, you would be less upset right now.
Right, and I would be in less trouble.
But I just wonder how many times someone, and again, you can tell right from the microphone, it's coming from a personal place, but I just wonder how many times it's a productive comment. Like, how many times does it move the needle towards, oh, now we're going to have a better conversation?
Well, what's your experience?
My experience is no, I don't take it well.
No.
And I mean, and I don't know if such a thing is true, to become less sensitive or to work on thickening your skin, so to speak. But if that is true, I've certainly been trying to do it. It's not debilitating, and anything like that, but it certainly colors my conversations at times.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, the comment, you're too sensitive, is basically saying, the bottom line is this is your fault.
It's a blame.
If we have a problem, it's blame. If we have a problem, it's because you are too sensitive. And so I would say there are two things to say. One is, okay, so my contribution to this might be that I had a bigger reaction than you expected or wished I had to what happened. And, I would observe that one of your contributions is that we've been friends or colleagues or spouses for a long time, and you still chose to do it, knowing that.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing that I think helps is coming back to that third piece of what happened around intention, because one thing that helps is separating intentions and impact. And so being able to say to the other person, I hear you saying, I think that you were not intending to upset me this much, or you didn't realize that I would have this big a reaction, or feel this whatever left out. And at the same time, that was the impact, actually. So I can accept that you didn't mean to, and I need you to accept that that was the impact anyway. Those two things often have a mismatch where people had good intentions or kind of no intentions because they were just busy and forgot. But it has a bad impact, and we have to actually hold each of those independently because they often coexist.
Wow. That's so good. That's going immediately into the bag of tricks. So thank you for that, Sheila.
Yeah. Let me say one more thing about it.
Please.
Because one of the things that also happens is people think, well, once I explain my good intentions, I didn't mean to offend you with that joke or leave you out or forget to invite you to the meeting. We expect that our good intentions will sanitize the impact on someone else. So therefore, you should not be upset. And part of holding them each as independently true is, okay, it's helpful for me to know that you didn't mean to, and I need you to know that I still felt whatever, offended, left out. And so one doesn't cancel out or sanitize the other.
Interesting. And in speaking on intentions, I've often heard to assume positive intentions, but I'm wondering if you would advise differently and assume no intentions until you find out. I don't want to try to read your mind, so I'll just ask you, is assuming positive intentions a productive tool?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I tend to assume that in most cases in difficult conversations, a whole bunch of smart, busy, and well-intentioned people have gotten themselves into a frustrating or upsetting or confusing situation. So assuming positive intent is often helpful and often accurate, but not always. And so I think the better assumption is to assume probably positive or at least neutral, but mostly I need to assume that I don't know, because other people's intentions are invisible to me. And even if I ask them about them, I have to decide whether to believe them or whether they're being honest with themselves about their intentions. So my purpose in the conversation might be to ask, but mostly it's to help them understand the impact that it had on me.
I like that. I like that a lot. You dipped into thanks for the feedback, and sometimes the books overlap a bit, and that's certainly a book well worth reading. I'd love to talk to you about that another time. But I do want to ask one thing that's kind of related here. The 5-to-1 ratio. There was a part that I don't want to reveal that just blew my mind, but make sure I got this correct. In feedback and communication, I want to make sure I get the terms right. It's productive and advisable to have a ratio of 5-to-1 positive to negative comments. Is that correct?
That stat, I think, comes from John Gottman and the research on marriage. Am I right about that?
Yes, it's Gottman's work, correct.
Yeah. So rather than it being exactly an equation for feedback, what he says is that marriages that are stable and lasting and happy tend to naturally hover around that 5-to-1 ratio of positive interactions to each sort of negative interaction. And so that leads you to say, well, why wouldn't 10-to-1 be better, right? Because that would be great. You have even less conflict. But what he says is couples that have a 10-to-1 ratio will say, they'll self-report that they're happy in their marriage, but once you go 3 or 5 years down the line, they are no longer happy or they've divorced, because that 10-to-1 ratio means somebody isn't bringing something up.
Yes, and that's the linchpin of why I kind of equated it with difficult conversations, because you're taking 5-to-1's great, 10-to-1's better.
Right.
But with 10-to-1, we're finding that you're not having the prerequisite enough difficult conversations, period.
Yeah, you're keeping things to yourself and avoiding in a way that actually adds up over time. And so the irony, of course, is that what I've noticed in myself, and certainly my co-authors also, is that as you start to get familiar with these skills and get better at difficult conversations, you actually have more of them, especially early, but you end up having them earlier in time, so that over time you're actually sorting things out in your relationships when they're lower stakes and much earlier before they really build into a bigger conflict or crisis.
17 years later, do you still enjoy having difficult conversations?
Enjoy is probably a strong word for anyone tackling difficult conversations, although I think they give me a lot less anxiety. And I do feel like my relationships are richer as a result. Like there's just an exhale that comes from like, whatever happens, we'll figure it out. We'll just talk about it, you know? And that actually is incredibly relaxing, whether it's in personal relationships or professional relationships.
Yeah, I actually just relaxed my shoulders a little bit when you said that. That's such a great tactical, conceptual idea. I love that. Circling all the way back to the tango. I wonder, do you believe in chemistry when it comes to conversations?
Oh, sure.
You do?
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me about your experiences with chemistry.
My experiences with chemistry include the fact that sometimes you're talking to someone and time flies by and you don't want time to go, and all of a sudden you could be talking to the person for 3 more hours. Converse that with you're talking to someone for 5 minutes and you know you never want to see them again in your entire life.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in a sense, I answered my own question, but I just didn't know if that was something you believed had backing in research or science, or was that truly something, when we chalk something up to chemistry, we often say we don't have an explanation for it.
Yeah, and there are a couple of different ways to think about chemistry, right? Chemists and scientists will talk about pheromones and sensory experiences that are below our awareness in most cases. But from a communication point of view, my observation is that the most interesting conversations are the ones that are incredibly engaged and connected, where the experiences of being fascinated and curious and wanting to hear more and really enjoying the give and take that comes naturally in the conversation, because both of you are so both genuine. We talk about a gap between your internal voice and your external voice, and the goal is actually to be able to say as much as you can of your internal voice, to be as transparent as possible. And I think of those conversations as conversations where I feel comfortable being quite transparent. Now, before you dump your internal voice into a conversation, often you want to negotiate with your internal voice, because if it's stuck in what I'm right about and why this is your fault, et cetera, then that's not going to be helpful. So the first negotiation is moving from I'm right to I wonder why we see it differently, and from blame to what am I contributing to this, and from why are you such a horrible person to I don't know your intentions, but I do want to share the impact on me, et cetera. But once I've made those shifts in my internal voice, I can be much more upfront and transparent and authentic. And I think that's where you get the chemistry experience that you're describing.
What an elegant idea, and I'm very excited about what we were able to cover here today. Now, is there anything we missed in broad strokes from the book that, before we send people to buy Difficult Conversations, is there any other insight that we missed or I glossed over today that we really should hit home?
Maybe one. Part of the reason that the feelings conversation is so important is that by the time something becomes a difficult conversation, often you actually have two issues going on. One is the surface issue of what we're disagreeing about. We're disagreeing about whether, we're going to take this out of my budget, or we're disagreeing about where we're going to go for the holidays, whether it's with your family or mine. But then there's a second issue that sits under that, which is really about how I feel treated in this relationship. Do you respect me? Do you care about what I want or how I feel? Do you think you can take advantage of me again, because I always have to cover it with my budget rather than yours, and you expect that that's the case? And so if we stay away from feelings, we may solve the surface problem of where we're going for the holidays or who's paying, but it's just going to the deeper question of how we feel treated in either the personal relationship or the working relationship is going to just manifest in a different surface problem next week or next month. And so if we're not going to talk about how we're working together or how we're living together, then we're not really talking about the real problem.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's the kind of idea that kind of cements my mission, which is to kind of have conversations on air that are worth going back to, that are worth sharing, that are worth revisiting. And I thank you so much for providing that. Sheila, where would you send people to learn more about you virtually or in your work?
Yeah, so on our website, which is triadconsultinggroup.com, or for short, diffcon.com, DIFFCON.com. Either one of those will take you to the Triad website. And there's a nav called Help Yourself. And that nav has reader's guides for people who want to read in your book group. It's got case studies that you can use with your team. It's got a whole bunch of free resources. So help yourself.
I love it. Sheila has written Difficult Conversations, and thanks for the feedback. And I don't know, maybe off air I'll talk her into writing a third book. But right now, Sheila, I just want to be extremely protective of your time. You've been incredibly generous, and I just thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. And if you have an idea for that third book, we're on the hunt for our next project.
That will make a great off-air conversation, Sheila. I appreciate that. I love it. Sheila Heen, everybody, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.